The portrait survives, a girl seated rigidly before a painted backdrop in a photographer's studio, 1862. The collodion plate shows her dress in exquisite detail, pleats falling in disciplined lines, hands folded properly in her lap. But the eyes ruin the composition. They do not look at the lens, they look through it, as though the camera were not an invention of chemistry and glass, but a barrier to some other hidden place. This image, now housed in a provincial archive, was once passed around as evidence, not of innocence, but of a scandal so profound it was said to involve men in pulpits, physicians with state licenses, and an entire county's worth of officials determined to forget. Clara Whitmore was only 14 when the trouble began. The official story insists she was a quiet child, destined for obscurity, that her family lived simply, kept to their pew, and asked no questions of those who held power. Yet newly uncovered correspondence, fragments of letters found sealed behind the paneling of an abandoned courthouse, tell another tale. They speak of words no minister could translate, of testimonies hastily redacted, and of men who swore under oath that language itself had turned against them. What began in the safety of a farmhouse parlor would spiral into hearings, disappearances, and the quiet removal of witnesses whose names no ledger now carries. The girl's silence in her portrait was not compliance, it was defiance, and the records show that defiance carried a cost. Before we continue deeper into this forgotten chapter of American history, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment with where you're listening from. It helps us bring more of these buried histories to light. The Whitmore family's farmhouse stood in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, land both fertile and cursed. By the mid-19th century, the region had become a patchwork of industrious farms, silent stone chapels, and the expanding rail lines that brought wealth to some while eroding the lives of others. It was a county at war with itself. Reformist sermons in one village, secret societies in the next. Into this world was born Clara, a daughter neither remarkable in station nor protected by patronage. The corruption of her story begins, as these stories often do, with prestige. Local accounts describe the Whitmores as hard-working but not impoverished, respectable enough to be noticed, but not powerful enough to resist when the gaze of the elite fell upon them. The rupture came not with fortune, but with language. For in 1862, Clara began to speak, and not in English. Not in German, the language of the local farmers, not in Latin, taught sparingly by ministers. She spoke in syllables no record could match, yet every word made the hair rise on the necks of those who heard. The first to record it was not a scholar, but a farmhand. He described it as a hymn without God, a tongue that bent grammar and yet demanded to be listened to. When the local pastor was summoned, he declared it a test. When the county physician arrived, he called it a fever, and when Clara refused to stop, her fate was sealed. The portrait remains, so too do the letters, brittle, water-stained, but undeniable. They are not stories whispered by firelight, but physical records kept under lock until recently unearthed. They tell us that what happened in 1862 was not an episode of illness, nor a child's mischief. It was an opening, and the men who tried to close it did so with methods as precise as they were merciless. Lancaster County in 1862 was a contradiction painted across farmland. On one hand, the air carried the smell of tilled earth, of horses straining against the plough, of wheat bundled neatly in the fields. On the other, it carried the iron tang of progress. The rail lines cut through soil like scars, the shrill whistles of locomotives piercing Sunday quiet. To the wealthy families who held shares in those lines, the county represented advancement, modernity, the inevitable triumph of commerce over rustic life. But to the tenant farmers, the widows, the mill hands, it meant a tightening fist. Rent rose, debts multiplied, and more than one preacher declared the land itself restless under such exploitation. The Whitmore family occupied a peculiar place in this arrangement. They were not destitute. Their farmhouse stood sturdy, 2 stories of whitewashed stone with dark timber trim, set back from the main road. Their land yielded modest but reliable harvests. Clara's father, Elias Whitmore, had built a reputation as both diligent and deferential, a man who asked no favors but paid his dues promptly. Her mother, Annabel, managed the household with quiet rigor, ensuring that Clara and her younger brother Samuel were fed, clothed, and trained in the decorum expected of God-fearing families. In community ledgers, the Whitmores were listed without annotation, neither marked by scandal nor elevated by patronage. Their respectability lay in their anonymity. Yet, within 20 years, their name would be cited in sermons, scrawled in medical notes, and scratched angrily into the margins of court documents. Before we descend further into this story, take a moment to comment if you've ever visited Lancaster County or heard of its buried scandals, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Life in Lancaster carried its own rhythms, and Clara was expected to follow them. She attended Sunday service in the local stone chapel, where sermons thundered against intemperance and secret sin. She studied her catechism by candlelight, her mother's stern gaze ensuring no answer went unmemorized. She helped in the fields when needed, carried water to the hired hands, and stitched plain dresses from fabric purchased in town. By all external measures, she was the model of a quiet, obedient daughter. But beneath the surface of such families, tension brewed. The Civil War raged to the south, and rumors spread like wildfire. Deserters hiding in barns, abolitionist pamphlets seized from trunks, wounded men drifting northward seeking care. Lancaster was not untouched. Elias Whitmore had been pressed for loans he could scarcely afford, pressured by those who claimed the rail expansion demanded patriotic contribution. Annabel, fiercely protective of her family's reputation, insisted they not be seen as political. Silence was their armor. It was into this silence that Clara's voice intruded. Her sudden use of unfamiliar words, her refusal to retract them, represented not only a mystery, but a disruption of order. Families like the Whitmores survived by being unremarkable. Their daughter had become remarkable overnight, and not in a way Lancaster tolerated. One early account comes from a neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, who noted in her diary, "The girl Whitmore, she speaks with a tongue not ours, it chills the marrow, as though she utters prayers from a darker pulpit." The entry was dated March of 1862, long before physicians or ministers formalized their suspicions. Already, whispers turned. Already the family's fragile armor of anonymity had cracked. What must be understood is this. In Lancaster County, language was power. The German-speaking farmers preserved their culture through dialect. The ministers guarded Latin as a sacred tongue. The English of contracts bound men to debt or freedom. For Clara to produce a language outside these categories was more than a curiosity. It was a threat. And when institutions feel threatened, they do not inquire. They move to erase. It began, as so many respectable scandals do, at the dinner table. The Whitmores, eager to maintain their modest standing, had agreed to host a small gathering in early spring of 1862. Nothing ostentatious. A simple meal with their pastor, Reverend Halbrook, his wife, and 2 neighbors. Elias believed it wise to reinforce the family's position in the community, particularly as whispers about the girl had begun to circulate. A proper meal, gracious manners, the child seated politely with downcast eyes. This was the prescription for erasing rumor. The meal began well enough. Roast lamb, boiled potatoes, bread baked that morning by Annabel's steady hand. Conversation turned, as it often did, to the war. Reverend Halbrook spoke of sacrifice. Elias nodded at each word. The clink of silverware punctuated the solemn rhythm of duty and providence. Clara sat quietly, her small hands folded neatly on her lap, until the hymn. As was custom, the Reverend proposed a prayer before the bread was cut. The table bowed heads. Words of thanks spilled forth in measured cadence, but when silence arrived, Clara's voice followed, not in English, not in the clipped German known to the farms, not in any tongue that her guests could identify. Her words carried melody and cadence, a structure too precise to be babble, yet so foreign it scraped at the ears. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Halbrook's hand trembled against her cup. Elias froze, his fork hovering mid-air. Annabel's voice cut across the table. "Clara, enough." But the girl's eyes had taken on a strange brightness, as though the words themselves pulled her forward. The Reverend demanded she stop. She did not. If this moment already chills you, take a second to like this video, share it, and comment if you believe children can speak languages never taught to them. Your support helps uncover more hidden histories like this. The aftermath of that dinner traveled faster than the smoke of the Whitmore's hearth. By dawn the following day, farmhands in neighboring fields muttered of demonic tongues. By the following Sabbath, Reverend Halbrook had delivered a sermon pointed enough to leave no doubt whom he meant. There are tongues not of man, nor of God, but of the adversary. Though he never named Clara, every listener understood. Elias tried to contain the fire. He insisted to neighbors that the girl had been overtired, perhaps fevered. He scolded Clara behind closed doors with such severity that Samuel, her younger brother, later recalled hearing his sister's sobs through the walls. Annabel, consumed with shame, forced Clara to scrub the floors, as if the labor could beat the strangeness out of her. But Clara did not recant. Nor did she forget. When pressed by her mother, she only whispered, "It is not mine. It is theirs." The they would never be explained. Within a fortnight, the first official notes appeared in the county physician's records. Subject female, age 14, exhibiting linguistic delusion, potential epileptic origin, further observation required. From that moment, Clara was no longer a farmer's daughter. She was a case. And cases in Lancaster County did not belong to families. They belonged to institutions. The county physician's note, brief as it was, marked the transition. From that moment, Clara Whitmore ceased to be just a daughter in a modest farmhouse. She became a specimen, scrutinized, recorded, and discussed in parlors where she herself was not welcome. The physician in question, Dr. Horace Latham, was a man deeply entangled in both science and politics. His signature appeared as often on medical records as it did on petitions endorsing the rail company. His interest in Clara was not pastoral. It was opportunistic. To him, a girl producing unstudied language could either be cured, thereby increasing his reputation, or condemned, which served the moral authority of his clerical allies. Either outcome advanced his stature. Within days of the dinner incident, Clara was summoned to his office. Accounts suggest she did not resist. In fact, she seemed oddly detached, as though her own fate were irrelevant. Witnesses later recalled how she sat in the stiff oak chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, while Dr. Latham interrogated her. He demanded repetition of her strange words. She complied, delivering long strings of syllables that neither matched known European tongues nor bore resemblance to indigenous dialects catalogued at the time. His notes, preserved in fragments, betray his unease. Cadence too precise for madness. No identifiable origin. Subject does not falter under repeated questioning. What chilled him most was not the sound of the language, but Clara's composure. She did not tremble, plead, or behave as children confronted by authority usually did. She answered in calm tones, as though she were not inventing speech but recalling it. If this revelation unsettles you, pause here to subscribe and comment whether you think the girl was gifted, cursed, or perhaps both. It helps us keep unearthing stories that others tried to bury. The church wasted time in seizing the narrative. Reverend Halbrook declared in Sunday sermon that the devil was known to twist tongues. He cited scripture, aligning Clara's words with the chaos of Babel. Congregants nodded, though many privately doubted. Some whispered that Clara's speech resembled prayer. Others said it carried the rhythm of law. What none admitted aloud was that it frightened them, and fear demanded a target. The neighbors too took notice. Diaries from that spring reveal unease spreading like rot. One farmer wrote of unseasonable winds stirring when Clara spoke. Another described animals bristling in her presence. Though embellishments are common in retrospective testimony, the consistency of such claims cannot be ignored. Each attributed atmosphere itself to the girl's utterances. For the Whitmores, containment became survival. Elias forbade Clara to speak in public. Annabel threatened to strike her should another word escape. Samuel, torn between loyalty and terror, begged his sister to stop. Clara did not. She whispered at night, fragments that Samuel would later recall without understanding, phrases that sounded less like incantations and more like instructions. Containment failed. By midsummer, the whispers had reached county officials. And with officials came records. And with records, the machinery of power. In the archives of Lancaster's courthouse, there exists a curious note attached to an otherwise routine property dispute, scrawled in the margin, barely legible, Whitmore matter, see draw. For years, historians dismissed it as clerical shorthand, irrelevant to the land case itself. Only recently did investigators realize its significance. It referred not to property, but to a drawer in Dr. Horace Latham's office, a drawer locked, pried open only after his death decades later. Inside were papers so brittle that many disintegrated upon touch, but enough survived to construct the outline of what Clara had endured. Among them, a phonetic transcription of her words, annotated with question marks, exclamations, and the repeated phrase, not fever. Another page contained references to observers present and a list of names, some crossed out. Most chilling was a fragment in the doctor's own hand. If authentic, it is not a sickness, but a contagion of order. What did he mean by contagion of order? The implication is stark. Dr. Latham feared not chaos, but the possibility that Clara's language held structure, rules, perhaps even authority. If such a thing were recognized, it would upend not only medicine, but the pulpit and the courthouse itself. Before I reveal the most damning document, take a second to like this video and share it with a friend who loves forgotten history. These are the fragments others tried to destroy. The drawer also contained a letter addressed only with the initials HK. The body of the letter survives in partial lines. The girl continues, sound as though commands, cannot be permitted to spread. Your presence requested, Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh. Why a matter rooted in Lancaster should involve an outsider from Pittsburgh remains one of the enduring questions of the case. Was HK a scholar, summoned for translation, or an operative, enlisted for something harsher? No surviving record reveals their identity, though later ledgers suggest the initials correspond to a figure with connections to industrial contracts. The discovery of this letter changes everything. Clara was no longer a curiosity or a medical subject. She had become the object of correspondence between men who understood the stakes. Her voice, or rather the language she carried, threatened systems far beyond her farmhouse. Annabel Whitmore, her mother, must have sensed it. Family lore preserved by distant cousins suggests Annabel was seen late at night burning scraps of paper in the hearth, her face pale, her eyes swollen from weeping. Elias, too, withdrew from his neighbors, avoiding the tavern where he once exchanged news. The family that had thrived on anonymity now seemed hunted by attention. Yet still, Clara spoke. She spoke in fields, she spoke in her room, and she spoke before men who carried notebooks. The more they tried to suppress her, the more the words emerged, unbroken, unaltered, and with each utterance the circle around her tightened. The letter to HK was only the beginning. In the months following Clara's first examinations, more documents appeared, not in the Whitmore home, but in the ledgers of men whose names carried weight across Lancaster. Parish records, court dockets, physician bills, each contained cryptic overlaps, like threads of a tapestry woven in secret. When lined up, they revealed a machinery at work, quiet but unmistakable. One ledger in particular, preserved in the archive of a local magistrate, contains entries that seem at first routine. Payments for clerical services, fees for consultation, notations of travel. But alongside them are entries marked with initials, HK, JT, MD, and, most unsettling, references to subject Whitmore. These were not donations nor charitable collections. They were disbursements, measured and methodical, as though an investigation, or suppression, was being financed. What stands out is the language of the ledger itself. Instead of medical diagnoses, one column lists methods. In the fragments that survived, historians have identified at least three: observation, containment, and resolution. Next to each method sits a figure in dollars and cents. This was not pastoral care, it was contract work. If this shocks you, if you're realizing how deep the machinery went, make sure to comment below what you think resolution meant and subscribe so you don't miss the next revelation. The web extended beyond Lancaster. A telegram from Harrisburg, dated August 1862, was later found folded into the back of a minister's sermon notes. It read simply, "Matter requires discretion. Ensure removal if persuasion fails." Who was being persuaded? Clara, her parents, or perhaps the community itself? The language suggests an escalation, that whatever Clara embodied, it could not be permitted to spread. She was not being treated. She was being managed, as one manages a disruption to property lines or trade contracts. The first to pay the price was not Clara herself, but a woman who tried to defend her. A cook employed by Dr. Latham later testified, before disappearing under suspicious circumstances, that she overheard men discussing the contagion of order in the physician's study. She claimed they feared not madness, but the possibility that Clara's words could compel obedience. When she asked questions, she was dismissed. Within weeks, her name vanished from the payroll, and her obituary listed a sudden domestic accident. Records show no accident report was ever filed. The system functioned with precision. Rumor was seeded from pulpits, records were altered in court ledgers, and payments ensured silence. Clara's language was never translated, but its threat was treated as real enough to mobilize a network of ministers, doctors, and magistrates. And still, in the farmhouse on a quiet Lancaster road, a 14-year-old girl spoke syllables no one could trace. Her family's silence crumbled, their anonymity erased. Every institution that should have protected her had instead begun to orchestrate her disappearance. The ledger entries trail off in late autumn, replaced by a single phrase, "Next stage approved." The next stage would not be persuasion, it would be elimination. By the close of autumn 1862, the machinery no longer circled Clara Whitmore. It had fixed itself upon her. The ledger entries that once listed her as subject began to change. The word observation gave way to resolution. The sums grew larger, the notations sharper, and one entry, scrawled in the corner margin as if hurried, bore her full name, Clara Whitmore, removal authorized. No longer an anomaly to be studied, now a problem to be solved. The Whitmores themselves seemed to sense it. Elias, once deferential to county officials, began avoiding the tavern altogether. Annabel was seen at market less often, her shawl pulled low across her face. Samuel, barely 10 years old, confided to a friend that men watch the fields at night. The men in question left no official record, but testimony from neighbors decades later fills the gap. Strange figures loitering near the farmhouse, always silent, never speaking to locals. Lamps glowing in the distance, extinguished the moment someone approached. One farmer claimed he found unfamiliar boot prints circling the Whitmore's barn, the soil pressed down by heels too polished for farm work. If you're beginning to see the terrifying pattern here, pause to share this video with someone who loves hidden history. And don't forget to subscribe, so you stay with us as this story deepens. Surveillance was not limited to men on roads. It crept into the very walls of the Whitmore home. Samuel later recalled, years after the family name had been blackened, how his sister's room was searched under pretense of inspection. Ministers came with elders, claiming to look for charms or pagan tokens. They rifled through her drawers, tapped the walls, and examined the stitching of her dresses. When nothing incriminating was found, they left with sterner warnings. But still, Clara spoke. By this stage, her words carried a weight that unnerved even the hardened. Witnesses described feeling a pressure in their chest when she spoke, as though the syllables themselves shifted the air. Cattle turned skittish, lamps flickered. Whether coincidence or not, the perception took hold. Her language was not harmless sound. It altered rooms. The cook's testimony before her sudden accident had mentioned this very fear, that Clara's words did not persuade, but compelled. If true, her existence was intolerable to those who thrived on command. One physician's surviving note reads, "Cannot allow contagion to spread. If others imitate, structure collapses." Structure, in this context, meant hierarchy. The pulpit over the pew, the magistrate over the tenant, the doctor over the patient. Clara's tongue was not merely foreign, it was insubordinate. And so, the system branded her dangerous. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right in ways they could not control. The final ledger entries of 1862 confirm it. In cold script, Stage 2, Surveillance, Stage 3, Resolution. Resolution meant only one thing. By winter of 1862, Lancaster's gossip had hardened into decree. Clara Whitmore was no longer spoken of as a child. She was called a vessel, a danger, a shame. In kitchens and at market stalls, her name was whispered with the same tones reserved for disease. And in pulpits, without naming her outright, ministers railed against tongues that blaspheme the order of heaven. For Clara, this was not containment. It was suffocation. The machinery turned not only through men in ledgers and magistrates' halls, but in the air she breathed. Children no longer played with her. Neighbors crossed the street when Annabel brought her to town. The family's produce sold more slowly at market, buyers murmuring excuses as though the wheat itself carried contamination. Rumor prepared the way for medicine. Dr. Horace Latham, the physician whose notes first framed Clara as a case, issued a declaration by February of 1863. Subject demonstrates symptoms consistent with hysteria, compounded by linguistic mania. The words were damning. In that era, hysteria was not a diagnosis, but a weapon. It pathologized resistance, especially in women, transforming defiance into illness and independence into disorder. If you're disturbed by how medicine was used to erase voices, stop here and comment, "I see the pattern," and make sure you subscribe so these buried truths aren't lost again. Annabel wept upon hearing it, but Elias, fearing loss of reputation more than anything, began to comply with Latham's treatments. Clara was subjected to tonics that dulled her senses, to cold baths meant to shock her back into silence, and to confinement in her room for days on end. Yet even weakened, even pale and trembling, the words came. She spoke them softly now, sometimes barely audible, but still they emerged with structure no one could deny. The community read her persistence not as resilience, but as confirmation. "See," they muttered, "even under treatment," she continues, "proof she is possessed." At this stage, surveillance sharpened. Strange men were seen loitering near the Whitmore farm at dusk, their presence explained as elders offering spiritual oversight. In truth, they were wardens without uniforms. Samuel, terrified for his sister, claimed years later that he once found a scrap of parchment tucked beneath the windowsill of her room, marked with her initials, her age, and the word resolution. The noose tightened, not with rope, but with categories. Clara was recast, not a daughter, not a neighbor, not even a patient. She was hysteria. She was case. She was subject. In the eyes of power, she was no longer human. And once humanity is stripped, anything is permissible. The machinery was moving swiftly now. Next came the plan, a gambit designed not just to silence Clara, but to erase her from the record altogether. Not everyone in Lancaster accepted Clara's condemnation. A handful of witnesses, poor, peripheral, but not blind, sensed the machinery tightening and tried to resist. Their names rarely survived official documents, but fragments reveal a desperate plan. It began with a farmhand, Jonathan Cray, who once worked the Whitmore fields. In a private letter later retrieved from a burned trunk, he wrote, "The girl is not mad. They fear her because she speaks without their blessing. It is the same fear that keeps us from owning the land we till." His words positioned Clara not as an aberration, but as a symbol, a threat to structures meant to remain unchallenged. Cray and two others, the dismissed cook from Latham's service and a schoolteacher sympathetic to the family, devised what historians now call the triple drop. The idea was simple: expose the conspiracy by placing evidence in 3 separate hands at once. The cook, before her accident, had already transcribed fragments of Clara's language and passed them quietly to the schoolteacher. Cray claimed to have overheard discussions in taverns that linked magistrates, ministers, and the physician himself. Together they determined that a simultaneous delivery to 3 authorities, a county prosecutor, a sympathetic newspaper editor in Philadelphia, and a detective rumored to investigate corruption, would make suppression impossible. Before I reveal how this plan unfolded, take a second to like this video and share it with anyone who needs to hear how power silences the powerless. And don't forget to subscribe. this story is far from over. The plan was dangerous. Every man and woman involved knew it. To accuse a physician of misconduct, a minister of deceit, and a magistrate of conspiracy was to risk not only reputation but life. Still, they pressed forward. Notes were drafted, letters copied. One set of transcriptions was hidden in the false bottom of a schoolhouse desk. Another was wrapped in oilskin and buried beneath a fence post. The final set was entrusted to a courier bound for Philadelphia. But the system was faster. The prosecutor received nothing. The editor reported that the courier never arrived. And the detective? Records suggest he was approached, but within weeks he too had been compromised, promoted suddenly to a position that demanded his relocation out of state. Of the 3 drops, none reached their intended mark. What did survive were traces: the burned trunk containing Cray's letter, the fractured diary of the schoolteacher, and the testimony, half-finished, of the cook. Together they outline not success, but failure, a last gambit smothered before it could ignite. For Clara, the consequences were immediate. Her defenders silenced, her family isolated, her very name now carried not in defense but in ledgers marked for resolution. The machinery had anticipated resistance, and it had learned how to absorb it. The failure of the triple drop marked a turning point. What had once been a struggle for containment became a campaign of erasure. Lancaster's institutions, pulpit, courthouse, infirmary, moved in grim unison, their coordination too precise to be accidental. The first casualty was the cook. Days after her testimony circulated privately among allies, she suffered what the coroner called a fall while tending the wash. Neighbors disputed it. She had been young, strong, no stranger to chores. Yet her death was filed swiftly, her burial hurried. The ledger of the magistrate noted a payment that same week. Resolution, domestic matter, concluded. The farmhand Jonathan Cray fared little better. His letter, later found charred in the ruins of a trunk, suggests he feared he was followed. Within weeks he vanished. No record of his departure exists. No body was ever recovered. His name simply evaporates from Lancaster's rolls after November 1862, as though erased by deliberate hand. The schoolteacher survived longest, though not untouched. He was accused of moral impropriety, a vague but devastating charge in a community where reputation was survival. Faced with disgrace, he fled to Baltimore, abandoning both his post and the children who trusted him. The last entry in his journal reads, "They are watching not only her, but me. There is no safety here." If this reminds you of how often truth-tellers are destroyed before their words are heard, pause now to comment, "I see the silencing," and subscribe so more of these buried records can reach the light. For Clara, each loss narrowed the circle around her. Her family, once proud of their quiet anonymity, now found themselves isolated. The pew where they once sat remained conspicuously empty. Elias walked to market alone, his shoulders stooped under whispers. Annabel, once stern, seemed brittle, as though every glance from a neighbor carried accusation. Clara herself was subjected to closer watch. Ministers arrived unannounced, pressing her with questions that veiled accusation as concern. Physicians repeated their examinations, dosing her with stronger tonics, documenting her hysteria in phrases designed to withstand scrutiny. Even Samuel, her younger brother, recalled years later how he was coached by an elder to observe his sister and report what she whispered at night. This was not medicine. This was surveillance disguised as care. And behind it all lay the machinery of erasure. When defenders arose, they were eliminated. When records surfaced, they were altered or destroyed. When families resisted, they were shamed into compliance. The ledger entries reflect the transition with chilling simplicity. Where once Clara was subject, she now appeared only under the term resolution. The amounts paid out grew, not shrank, as though silence required greater investment than study. The system had learned that exposure was the only true danger. And so it moved not merely to silence Clara, but to stage a spectacle that would discredit her forever. That spectacle would come in the form of a public scene, carefully orchestrated, brutally effective, and impossible for the Whitmores to resist. The machinery understood one truth with surgical clarity. Destruction in secret creates martyrs, but destruction in public creates monsters, and so the decision was made. Clara Whitmore would not simply be silenced, she would be performed into madness. The event took place in late winter of 1863, on a Sunday when the entire county seemed gathered in the stone chapel. Snow clung to the eaves, horses steamed outside, and the congregation packed the pews until the air was thick with wool and breath. The Reverend Halbrook announced the service would be special. Few questioned. They had heard the whispers all winter. Now they would see. At the midpoint of the sermon, the doors opened. Elias and Annabel entered, flanking their daughter. Clara, pale from weeks of confinement and tonics, wore a plain dress buttoned tightly to the throat. Her eyes darted to the congregation, not with fear, but with recognition. She knew why she had been brought. Halbrook did not name her. He didn't have to. He spoke instead of corruption within our homes, of tongues that mock the order of heaven. As his words thundered, parishioners glanced not at him, but at the girl seated between her parents. Then came the moment. A hymn began, voices rising in familiar cadence. And in the silence between verses, Clara spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. The strange syllables tumbled from her lips, carrying rhythm and weight that stilled the room. It was not frenzy, it was precision. But precision was more terrifying than babble. The congregation recoiled as though struck. One woman fainted. A man shouted, "Possessed!" Elias gripped his daughter's arm so tightly she flinched, but the words continued. If this scene chills you, a child forced to become her own condemnation, take a second to share this video with someone who should hear it and subscribe so we can continue exposing these asked histories. The Reverend raised his hand and with theatrical timing declared, "The adversary reveals itself." Gasps spread through the pews. The hymn books fell shut like gunshots. Clara was dragged to her feet, her mother weeping, her father rigid with humiliation. What the congregation witnessed that day was not Clara's language, but her discrediting. The machinery had succeeded. Her words, once whispered with curiosity, were now framed as public blasphemy, and the ledger's promise of resolution advanced to its next stage. Witness accounts afterward differed in detail, but aligned in tone. They did not see a girl, they saw a vessel. They did not hear language, they heard corruption. The system had staged the perfect inversion, transforming evidence of order into proof of madness. When the hymn resumed, Clara was gone, led out a side door by men in black coats. The service concluded, the snow fell heavier, and by the time the congregation spilled into the streets, the verdict was sealed. Clara Whitmore was no longer a daughter of Lancaster County. She was an aberration marked for removal. After the chapel, Clara never again slept beneath the roof of her family's farmhouse. Within 24 hours, officials arrived with paperwork already drafted, signed, and sealed. The language was clinical, almost merciful in its detachment. Commitment warranted due to symptoms consistent with hysteria and ungovernable speech. Admission authorized to county sanitarium for treatment and protection. Protection, the word appears 3 times in the document, but whose protection was intended, not Clara's? The sanitarium stood 2 miles outside town, its facade a grim imitation of gentility, red brick, white trim, iron gates. To the public it promised safety, healing and order. To those who entered it promised silence. Once confined, patients rarely emerged, and if they did, they bore the vacancy of souls emptied by treatment. Clara was escorted through its gates in March of 1863. Witnesses described her walking steadily, not resisting, her face unreadable. Annabel trailed behind in tears. Elias signed the papers with trembling hand. Samuel, forbidden to attend, later said he never forgave his parents for yielding her so easily. Inside, the treatment began at once. Tonics laced with opiates, cold immersion, weeks in isolation, punctuated only by examinations that read more like interrogations. Physicians wrote in detached prose, patient persists in linguistic delusion, words bear rhythmic quality, no sign of cessation. They described her not as a girl, but as a malfunctioning organ, an object that must be corrected or discarded. If this makes your stomach turn, the way medicine has been used to erase the inconvenient, take a second to comment, erased by care, and subscribe so more buried truths can be unearthed. The sanitarium files reveal something stranger still. Several attendants reported that Clara's words continued even under sedation. One noted "I am by" on the margin of his log. Lips move though patient unconscious. Language persists independent of waking state. Another recorded that patients in adjacent rooms claimed to dream of her voice, repeating phrases they could not understand. Such observations were quickly crossed out by superiors. In their place, the bland assurance of treatment ongoing. The longer Clara remained, the more her humanity was stripped. Letters from her mother went unanswered. Visitors were denied. By summer, the Whitmores received word that their daughter was too unstable for family contact. Annabel collapsed upon reading it. Elias never spoke of her again. The ledger, however, spoke clearly. Payments continued, larger now, under the category maintenance. The word resolution appeared one final time beside Clara's initials. After that, silence. No death certificate survives, no grave has been located. Only the sanitarium's register, a thick leather book, records her final entry. In faded ink, Whitmore, Clara, female 14, transferred, March 1863, outcome, concluded. Concluded. That single word sealed her erasure. What follows Clara's disappearance into the sanitarium is perhaps more chilling than the commitment itself, the systematic erasure of her existence. Within weeks of her admission, records began to vanish. Parish logs from the Whitmore's chapel, intact for decades before, show entire pages removed for the year 1863. Court files bearing the family's name are marked with an abrupt notation. Withdrawn, no further inquiry. Even the physician's ledger, so meticulous in its earlier entries, contains blank spaces where Clara's case had once been detailed. The destruction was not random. It was coordinated. Neighbors recalled smoke rising from the rear of the courthouse one spring morning, though no official notice of a fire was ever issued. Later investigation confirmed that bundles of paper had been consigned to flames, not damaged by accident, but deliberately burned. One clerk, speaking decades later, admitted he had been ordered to make the Whitmore file disappear. His words were simple. It was as though she had never been. If this revelation enrages you, the idea that lives can be scrubbed from history, stop now and share this video so more people learn what was hidden, and subscribe so we can keep restoring what was erased. Even testimony was smothered. The farmhand, Jonathan Cray's letter, the schoolteacher's journal, the cook's fragments, all were either destroyed or smeared with accusations that rendered them suspect. Cray was branded a deserter, the teacher disgraced, the cook reduced to gossip. In every case, credibility was assassinated before their accounts could be trusted. By the end of 1863, Lancaster spoke of Clara only in whispers, if at all. The official story had hardened. The Whitmore's daughter had suffered a fit of hysteria, been committed for her own safety, and perished quietly under care. Nothing more needed saying. But the silence speak louder than words. Why remove pages from parish logs? Why burn courthouse papers? Why strike out the very notations that physicians once relied upon to prove their diligence? The answer is written in the margins that survived, notes crossed out in haste, words overwritten but still legible beneath. Language persists, contagion of order, resolution approved. These fragments remain as scars, evidence of the record that was meant to be annihilated. For the Whitmore family, the erasure was complete. Elias refused to answer questions, turning away neighbors who asked. Annabel, broken by grief, carried Clara's photograph in a locket until her own death, but never spoke her daughter's name aloud again. Samuel grew into a man who left Lancaster altogether, changing his surname, perhaps to escape the weight of a history no one dared acknowledge. The county moved on, the sanitarium thrived, the rail lines expanded, and Clara's name became ash. But ash, if sifted carefully, still leaves outline. By the late 1860s, Lancaster County gleamed with the polish of prosperity. Rail lines carved efficient arteries across farmland, bringing goods, passengers, and profit to those who had invested wisely. Brick storefronts rose in town, polished glass windows displaying silks, tools, and fine shoes imported from Philadelphia. Ministers boasted of rising congregations, physicians of modern treatments, magistrates of swift justice. On the surface, it was a county ascending. But beneath that surface lay a grave without a marker, the grave of Clara Whitmore, whose very existence had been scrubbed from public record. The sanitarium prospered most of all. Families across Pennsylvania, reassured by its promises of discretion and order, sent their inconvenient members, wives too melancholic, sons too unruly, daughters too questioning, into its gates. What happened inside rarely emerged, but the institution's reputation for quiet conclusions attracted steady investment. The ledger, once a private tool of control, became a business model. Clara was its prototype. If this realization unsettles you, that one girl's silencing could become a blueprint for an entire system, pause here and comment, "History repeats," while you subscribe so we can continue tracing these hidden patterns. Her story, officially forgotten, lived on in whispers. Farmhands told of hearing her language in their dreams. Mothers warned their children never to speak strange words, lest they be taken. Samuel, the younger brother, carried his memories like a wound. In later years, he told his own children that Clara had spoken as if reading from a book the rest of us couldn't see. They dismissed it as grief until one grandchild recorded the phrase in a journal, the only surviving family account of Clara's voice. Meanwhile, the machinery of erasure perfected itself. Each scandal that threatened Lancaster's elite followed the same choreography. Rumor first, diagnosis second, institutional removal third, destruction of records fourth. By the time the pattern was recognized, it was too late. The model had spread. Other counties copied it. Other sanitariums thrived. Other voices were silenced. The irony is stark. Lancaster celebrated itself as a county of progress, moral, industrial, medical, yet its progress was built on selective forgetting, on the sacrifice of those deemed disruptive. The very rail lines that gleamed with promise were greased with the same silence that had swallowed Clara. The girl who spoke a language no one knew became the foundation for a system that ensured no inconvenient voice would ever again be heard. The story might have ended there, a quiet tragedy buried under prosperity.
Did not vanish.
Documents have a way of surviving where men do not. And in the decades that followed, scraps
Lancaster's
emerged,
sanitarium
a ledger
had become a
fragment
model
here,
cited
a
in
letter
medical
from
journals
HK there,
for its humane
small
commitment
cracks in the
practices.
facade.
Doctors
Cracks through which
its
Clara's
wards.
voice still
Ministers
seeps.
praised its discretion. Magistrates pointed to its efficiency. Not once did those glowing accounts mention the Whitmore girl, yet in private her case was used as precedent. The phrase, Whitmore method, appears in correspondence between physicians of the period, shorthand for swift removal when disorder threatened stability. It was a system that punished not the body but the voice. The machinery learned to weaponize silence. A woman who challenged her husband's authority might be diagnosed with hysteria. A son who refused factory labor could be branded melancholic. In each case, the path was the same: community rumor, medical framing, institutional vanish. And in each case, the Whitmore precedent, invisible, unnamed, guided the hand that signed the papers. Occasionally, someone tried to remember. In 1879, a reformist newspaper in Philadelphia published a brief editorial referencing a girl of Lancaster committed for speaking tongues never translated. Within a week, the piece was retracted. The editor issued a public apology, citing erroneous sources. Historians suspect the pressure came from benefactors tied to the sanitarium itself. Even within the Whitmore family, memory became dangerous. Samuel, now grown, once attempted to petition for access to the sanitarium's records. He was denied. Soon after, his farm lease was revoked without explanation. He moved west, abandoning Lancaster forever. His children later claimed he never again spoke his sister's name. If this makes you feel the weight of generational silence, pause here to share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so these buried voices aren't lost again. By the turn of the century, Clara had been absorbed into rumor rather than record. Some called her possessed, others insane. A few whispered she had been chosen, though chosen for what none dared say. The truth lay in fragments scattered across archives, fragments that only recently have been pieced together. And yet her legacy lingers in absence, in the pages torn from parish logs, in the burned bundles of courthouse files, in the blank spaces where her name should be. Institutions perfected the art of not only silencing the living, but sterilizing the memory of the dead. The legacy of silence is itself a language, one spoken fluently by power. But silence can never be perfect. For every record erased, a margin note remained. For every ledger burned, a line of transcription survived. And through those cracks, Clara's story presses upward, like grass through stone. Her language was never translated. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Perhaps the point was not meaning, but defiance. Sound that refused subjugation, syllables that unsettled the order, and that defiance did not die in 1863. It still echoes. By the 1880s, Clara Whitmore's name was no longer spoken in Lancaster. The sanitarium flourished, the ministers boasted of order restored, and the county grew rich on rails and mills. Yet shadows lingered in the periphery, the stubborn persistence of those who refused to forget. The last real confrontation came not from Lancaster itself, but from within Clara's own family. Samuel Whitmore, her younger brother, had grown into a man shaped by silence. He carried the memory of his sister like a scar, rarely mentioned but never healed. In 1882, nearly 20 years after her disappearance, he returned briefly to Lancaster with a petition. He demanded access to sanitarium records, not only of Clara, but of all those committed without trial. The request was summarily denied. Officials declared the records confidential, citing patient privacy. Samuel pressed further, producing affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed his sister's removal. For his trouble, he was branded a malcontent. His name appeared in county newspapers alongside words like agitator and disgraced farmer. Within months, his lease was revoked, his livestock seized for debt, his reputation ruined. Samuel left Lancaster and never returned. He resettled in Ohio under a different surname, raising children who would grow up knowing only fragments, that their father had once had a sister who spoke in ways no one understood, and that he carried both pride and grief in her memory. If this moment breaks your heart, the idea of a brother silenced alongside his sister, take a second to comment, remember Clara, and subscribe so her name does not vanish again. As for Elias and Annabel, Clara's parents, their fates were quieter but no less tragic. Elias, already humiliated by his daughter's scene in the chapel, retreated into bitterness. His name appears only in tax rolls, diminishing steadily until Adrian is death in obscurity. Annabel lingered longer, but her grief hollowed her. In the Whitmore family Bible, still preserved, she penciled one cryptic line beneath the genealogical entries. She was not mad. She was taken. That line is the only surviving acknowledgement from the family itself. Meanwhile, the sanitarium continued its quiet work. Reports show that by the 1890s, more than 24 women and children had been committed under circumstances disturbingly similar to Clara's. Each case followed the same choreography: rumor, diagnosis, vanish, erasure. None were remembered. The system had perfected its rhythm. Clara was its overture. Yet every system carries the seed of its own collapse, and in Clara's case the collapse would not come from Lancaster, but from the cracks left unsealed. The ledger fragments, the charred letters, the whispers that persisted in families like Samuel's. For when records resurface, they do not merely tell of the past, they accuse the present. And Clara's voice, though silenced in 1863, was not done accusing. For nearly half a century, Clara Whitmore remained little more than a whisper in Lancaster's memory, a cautionary tale without a body, a ghost story without a grave. But ghosts have ways of returning, not through apparitions, but through paper.
In 1911, during renovations of the old courthouse, carpenters pried loose a panel of oak and discovered a cache of folded correspondence wedged deep within the wall. The documents were water-stained, gnawed by rodents, yet legible in places. Among them, the incomplete letter from Dr. Horace Latham to the mysterious HK fragments of transcriptions of Clara's speech and notations that matched the ledger discovered years later. The language was stark, clinical, and incriminating. Subject persists, contagion of order, ensure resolution. The discovery sparked brief curiosity among archivists, but the county moved swiftly to neutralize its impact. The papers were catalogued blandly as miscellaneous medical fragments circa 1860s. Public exhibition was denied, only a few scholars were allowed to study them, and most were discouraged from pursuing publication. Still, copies leaked. One of those copies reached a reformist journal in Philadelphia. In 1913, it ran a short piece entitled "The Vanishing of Clara W." The article was restrained, more suggestion than accusation, but its implication was clear. Lancaster's sanitarium had not healed, but hidden. For weeks, letters to the editor poured in, some demanding inquiry, others denouncing the journal for blasphemy. Then, as so often happens, the uproar was smothered by silence. The next issue carried a retraction. Yet the seed had been planted. If you believe stories like Clara's demand to be retold, even a century later, stop now and like this video, share it with someone who values truth, and subscribe so these voices aren't buried again. The most damning fragment coming. Decades later, in the 1940s, when a box of sanitarium ledgers was discovered in an estate sale. Within its brittle pages, her name appeared, abbreviated but unmistakable. Whitmore C. Stage 3. Resolution approved. That phrase alone confirmed what generations had whispered. Clara had not been treated. She had been targeted. By mid-century, historians began to connect the threads, the burned files, the erased parish logs, the vanished defenders, the coded ledger entries. Together, they told a story not of madness, but of elimination. Clara was the precedent. Her silence had enabled an entire machinery of institutional erasure. The exposure never achieved the full reckoning it deserved. Lancaster's elite had long since died, their fortunes secured, their reputations embalmed. But the fragments endured, each one an indictment that paper, once hidden, now revealed. Through those scraps, Clara spoke again. Not in the language no one understood, but in the margins, the ledgers, the surviving ink, a language of evidence, a language of accusation, and that accusation lingers still. Clara Whitmore did not live to see adulthood. She left no diaries, no children, no grave that can be visited. What survives of her life exists only in fragments, a photograph in an archive, charred letters from a farmhand, ledger entries coded with the word resolution, and yet those fragments tell us more than silence ever intended. Her story is not just about a girl who spoke a language no one knew. It is about how institutions respond when order itself is challenged. Ministers invoked the pulpit, physicians weaponized medicine, magistrates rewrote the law. Together they formed a machine that devoured the inconvenient. Clara was its first proof of concept, a test case. And when the test succeeded, the model replicated, generation after generation. What began in a Lancaster farmhouse in 1862 spiraled outward into sanitariums across the state, into courtrooms, into sermons, into every system that prefers silence to disorder. The pattern is clear: rumor, diagnosis, removal, erasure. It was not an accident. It was curriculum. If you've stayed with Clara's story to this point, let her name live again. Comment Clara's voice below, subscribe and share this story so that silence does not win twice. The moral reckoning is stark. History remembers the powerful not for their mercy but for their control. The Whitmores were ordinary, defenseless, unremarkable, until their daughter refused to be. For that she was destroyed, but destruction never erases completely. It leaves scars in the record, smoldering embers in ledgers, whispers passed down until someone listens. To read Clara's story today is to hear those whispers rising into speech. Her language may remain untranslated, her syllables lost to time, but the meaning is clear enough. It is the meaning institutions feared most, that a voice unlicensed by power could command attention, could alter the air itself, courthouse, would expose that the order they claimed was never order at all, only control. Lancaster prospered, its sanitarium celebrated, its records purified by fire. But each erasure testifies against itself. Every blank page screams louder than ink. Clara's absence is itself an indictment, proof that her presence mattered enough to destroy. And so the reckoning is this. Monsters are not born from the ether. They are made in boardrooms, pulpits, and offices, wearing collars and carrying ledgers. They speak in the language of authority, while silencing those who dare to speak otherwise. Clara Whitmore's fate reminds us that the greatest horrors are not supernatural, but institutional, not phantoms in the night, but men in daylight. The portrait remains. The eyes that do not look at the lens still accuse. The silence of the record still trembles with words no one translated, but everyone feared. Clara spoke a language no one knew, and in the act of silencing her, Lancaster revealed its own tongue, the language of betrayal, of erasure, of power cloaked as care. It is a language we still hear, if we choose to listen.